I'm especially privileged to be addressing my in-laws in this very important deliberation.
Wow.
Let me begin this presentation titled "The Many Unanswered Questions of the Biafran Genocide." Because let me speak directly, I'm in no doubt that this was genocide. My occupation is as a lawyer, and in particular as a trial lawyer, and I'm used to investigating evidence. And as Dr. Uche, who spoke earlier, explained, that evidence sometimes, or oftentimes, is not easy to get directly. So you've got to make use of what is available. In fact, Dr. Uche, I might say, exemplifies the excellence of the Igbo people, which is shared by my Yoruba people. He's a doctor, and yet the exposition that he delivered, many lawyers will have been very proud of being able to address the legal issues as he did. But let me begin by inviting my friend, Mr. Bonnie Uba of the Fatherland Group, to play a very short video that tells you or help us to understand what we're dealing with in this quest for evidence, the evidence of what really happened and this genocide. Bonnie, could you please play that video?
Years before, by falsifying the results of a national census. Professor David Anderson.
In the 1950s, it was certainly to the advantage of the British to do, as you've described, to increase the population of the North, because it would shift the relative balance of power in the assembly. It's very difficult to find evidence that elections have been rigged. People tend not to write about these things. If one sees ballot boxes being stuffed, voters being bussed around, if one uncovers fraud on the electoral roll, these are all forms of proof. The elections in Nigeria in 1959, none of those things were reported.
But it seems that finding the evidence is perhaps less of a problem than actually getting my hands on it. Amongst the hundreds of files housed in London's National Archives that cover this period of British rule in Nigeria are two marked closed for 100 years. They deal with the role of both the Governor-General, Sir James Robertson, and the leader of the NCNC, Dr. Ezekwe, but aren't due to be open to the public for another half a century. I've put in a request under the Freedom of Information Act to view them now, but I'm still awaiting a response, as is Professor David Anderson.
Clearly someone in the British government, when those files were classified, didn't want us historians to know something about what they contain. And that raises my suspicions that those files might contain information about whatever deals were brokered between the British government and the NCNC. Because it is certainly the case that the NCNC could not have won the election support it did without British support, or nor that it could have formed a coalition with the MPC at independence without British support. So I would love to see what's in those two files about Sir James Robertson and Dr. Ezekwe.
Thank you very much. So there's a box of documents classified in 1960, not to be opened for 100 years, containing relevant evidence to the events that then happened. Now, those who are lawyers will understand the role of presumptions when you're dealing with evidence and you're trying to establish what happened. And in circumstances where somebody has relevant evidence and decides to withhold that evidence, then we are entitled to draw inferences against the persons who are withholding that relevant evidence. So I want you to keep in mind in my presentation the fact that we're operating without the contents of that file that will not be opened until 2060, by which time all of us will have left this earth, unless we are newborn babies. This then raises the first of the many unanswered questions about the Biafran genocide. And it is this: what did the Igbos specifically, and the Easterners more generally, what did they do to the British to deserve this fate and treatment? I mean, when you consider that they took to Christianity, that the British brought, the British faith, and they served the British loyally. This is what explains why you had Eastern and specifically Igbo presence right across the Nigeria space, because they were often working in the support services of that colonial administration. So what is it that the Igbos and the Easterners did to deserve the treatment that they got from the British? In my reckoning, this genocide, what happened to the Igbos in the pogroms and in the war, and the two have to be looked at together, not in isolation. It was a continuation, and that will become clear in the course of my presentation. It was worse than Hiroshima, because when you look at these issues objectively, if you want to try and understand where Nazi Germany, and specifically Hitler, his rationalization of what he did to the Igbo people, you will find this in his book, Mein Kampf. These were community residents in Germany, and he perceived them as having acted against German interests in the First World War. Now, you don't have to agree with him. It's perfectly rational to take the view that that's a nonsense, but yet that was the explanation that he put forward. But what is the explanation that can be tendered to rationalize the British position in relation to the Igbo peoples and the Easterners generally? It's difficult to understand. The other distinction as regards Hiroshima is this, that the Igbos, certainly after 1967, I should say the Easterners, after 67, unlike the Jews, were in their own land. Where this genocide was perpetrated against them, it was in their own land. They weren't like the Jews in Germany. They were in their own land. Now, I'm going to deal with this presentation by taking you through some relevant books. At this point, I'll share my screen. And here we are. I'm going to be speaking by reference to a number of books. I will assure you that they're not all written by me. This particular collection is the biography of a gentleman, Joseph Chamberlain, who was the British colonial secretary from 1895 until 1906. I will tell you right now, you could almost put Lugard aside, and you can almost put Goldie aside, that this fellow was the architect, the grand architect of what we now know as Nigeria. But its specific relevance to the genocide is this, that he was the one who, at the point of being ready to go to war against France, he was the one that brought in the what I call the lofts in Nigeria. If you look at the map of West Africa, you'll see that the high points of Ghana, Togo, Ivory Coast is broadly in line. When you get to Nigeria, you will see that it almost looks like a loft has been added. That loft area is what is now the Sharia territories. That's where you see the Sokoto, Zamfara, Kano, etc., etc. That strip came into British possession as a result of a secret treaty between the British and the French in 1890. Chamberlain was insisting that come what may, that part of the Nigeria space, or what became the Nigeria space, must remain or must come to Britain. And there was a trade-off whereby the British released their territorial interests in Madagascar, off the coast of East Africa. There was a swap. So in return for the French taking the whole of Madagascar, i.e. the British releasing their territorial claims in Madagascar, Britain got what is now the Sharia Strip. So this is very material when one is seeking to understand the roots and the origin of this genocide. The other important consideration is the role of the Nigerian army and the genesis and the history of the Nigerian army. Now, one of the issues that Dr. Uche touched upon earlier was this: was there an intent to physically destroy the Igbo nation? And he expanded upon that by saying that evidence of intent to destroy can be found by drawing inferences from the actions that we actually see. So we now look at the Nigerian army. And there was an article that I came across titled "The Nigerian Army as a Product of its Colonial History." And this was the quotation that struck me. The creation of the Nigerian army began with colonialism, introduced a pattern of cohesion described in this work as partitioned cohesion, a situation in which a group, although seen as one, is subtly separated into units in which some are shown certain preferences. So the Nigerian army, seemingly, by virtue of the name Nigerian army, seemingly appearing as one, was actually structured and compartmentalized such that the Igbo strands or the eastern strands were distinct from the northern strands. And by the way, the Yoruba had been shut out of the army. The excuse and the propaganda that they pushed was that the Yoruba are cowards and that's why they weren't in the army. Of course, that was a lie, because when you understand how Sokoto, the Sokoto Empire as it was conquered by the British, it was actually Yoruba troops that they used in the conquest of Sokoto. But let me not digress too much as far as the makeup of this army is concerned. We heard briefly about Harold Smith. When you want to understand the roots of this genocide, you must understand the Harold Smith story. He was that British colonial officer, a lone ranger who spoke up about the rigging of that independence elections, even at great cost to himself. But the book that I really want for you to focus in on, in terms of the genesis of the genocide, is this. This book, Nigeria, The Prospects for Democracy, written by Chief H.O. Davis, QC. It was published and note this date, it was published in January 1961. The coup does not happen, the first coup does not happen until 15th of January 1966. So but if a book is published in January 1961, you can assume that the research and the writing was taking place before independence in October 1960, because that's just how long it takes books to be produced. Chapter 2 of this book was titled Military Regime in Burma, Pakistan, and Sudan. These were all British territories where military regime had already happened. Again, this is important when we seek to understand the events that then led to the genocide in Nigeria. Here's the quotation, my first quotation from this book, which shows the advanced thinking behind the move to the presidential system of government. Bear in mind, the presidential system didn't come in until 1979, after the war. This book was published in January 1961, and here's my first extract. The breakdown of parliamentary government in the countries under study, that is Burma, Pakistan, and Sudan, carries with it no implication that some other system of democratic government might not have succeeded where the cabinet government system has failed. And here's the important bit. We have suggested that a system in which the executive and the legislative functions are separated, as in the American presidential system, would appear to be preferable in newly established democracies. So that is signaling the move to the American presidential system. This is important when you seek to then understand that coup that was blamed on the Igbos, but I'll come to that in more detail. The next quotation gives us the roadmap, and this is what it said. The real adjustment is the economic development and industrialization calculated to effect a balance between the developed state of parliamentary institution and the improvement in education, industry, and technology. The disequilibrium may be so severe that temporary expedients of military regime or one-party rule are called for. So it's saying, this is 1961, this book is published, that the parliamentary system, there's a gulf between the fundamental economic development and industrialization that's needed to support the parliamentary system, and also the improvement in education. And that disequilibrium may be so severe that temporary expedients of military regime or one-party rule are called for. The tendency is to withdraw the more advanced parliamentary machine while the development of the complementary institutions of education and industry are speeded up. So it's saying in 1961 that the parliamentary system is too sophisticated for where we are, running ahead of ourselves. So you need to apply the brakes by way of the temporary expedience of military regime in order for us to bridge the gap. And the final quote that I want to share from this book is this, and this is important for you to make a note of this and keep it in mind when I come back to the MPC manifesto in the so-called independence elections. Here's the quote. Nigeria has a very small army and a nucleus of a navy. It has no air force. This is a good omen in the light of our analysis, which minimizes the possibility of a military coup. In the 1959 election manifesto of the MPC, there is a demand for the formation of a large army and expansion of the Navy, and the formation of the nucleus of an air force, and the expansion of the police force No reasons were given. Indeed, none can be given in a manifesto. There is no doubt that in formulating their policy, the MPC leaders gave due weight to the dangerous possibilities of a large army and an expanded air force at the present stage of the country's development. So there's a book published in 1961, January 1961, making the point that Nigeria, at the time of research and writing, the army was very small, only a nucleus of a navy and no air force. And that this is a good omen in the light of our analysis, which minimizes the possibility of a military coup. And then we see in the MPC manifesto a commitment for a large army, an expansion of the navy, and the formation of an air force and the expansion of the police force. Interestingly enough, the foreword to that book was written by Sir Tafawa Balewa. That's an important detail. So he understands what's been said in that book, and it's particularly relevant when you keep in mind the letter that had been written by the last British colonial governor of northern Nigeria, Brian Sherwood Smith, to Balewa, when Balewa asked him to list 10 things that the North needed to secure their position once the British left. And Sherwood Smith's response was that you don't need 10, you only need 3. One we've already given you, which is 50% of the seats in the legislature, so nobody can outvote you. And then you need the control of the police and the control of the army. So it is very relevant that the foreword to this book, published in January 1961, was written by Balewa. But even more interesting is the fact that, and by the way, that's the book written by the last British governor of northern Nigeria, in which I came across the letter written in confidence that Sherwood Smith had sent to Balewa in terms of the importance of control of the army when things break down. And then lo and behold, what then happens when things break down? Who is in control of the army? But who was in control of the army up until, in fact, it's not even up until independence. It was a Briton that was head of the army. Would you believe it? Independent Nigeria, independence nominal is 1st of October, 1960. But at that point, the head of the army is still a Briton. In fact, he remains head of the army up until February 1965. That's just 11 months before the January 15 coup, when Aguiyi Ironsi then became head of the army. Sorry, it was February 65 that Aguiyi Ironsi became head of the army. But there was a Briton, an army that had been shaped by Britain, made by Britain, and headed by Britain, right up to February 1965. The Air Force, in actual fact, was established in 1964. So at the time the Nigerian Air Force was established, which played such a significant role in the genocide against the East, a Briton was head of the army that put that Air Force in place. Now, one of the curious questions about the genocide is this: how was Sardauna and Balewa and the MPC generally, how were they persuaded to accept Aguiyi Ironsi, an Easterner, an Igbo man, as the head of the army in succession to the Briton? Let me repeat that question. How were the North persuaded that Aguiyi Ironsi, an Igbo man, an Easterner, should be the head of the army particularly given that letter that Sherwood Smith had written to Balewa, warning him, or at least informing him, of the importance of control of the army. That's one of the very important unanswered questions. And bear in mind, this was being done at a time when a quota system was being introduced into the army to contain the recruitment of Igbos into the army. So how were the North persuaded to accept Aguiyi Ironsi as the head of the army? Then we move to the coup, the January 15, 1966 coup, which they say was an Igbo coup, which I say is a nonsense. It was simply propaganda as part of the process. And I think Dr. Uche touched on it earlier in his presentation, of scapegoating and labeling a group for massacre. That this was supposed to be the Igbo coup. But how credible is that when one considers that the leader of the coup, Nzogu, and let me now move to the next book in the sequence. This is the book Nzogu, written by, who was then his best friend, Olusegun Obasanjo. In that book, you will find the evidence that we're asked to believe this Igbo nationalist, who was born and grew up in the North, could hardly speak the Igbo language, wouldn't never be able to find his way to his hometown in the East. But nevertheless, this fellow was supposed to be an Igbo nationalist. This is the fellow who, by his own hand, killed the revered leader of the North, Ahmadu Bello, shot him personally, is documented. And yet, curiously, this fellow received a state burial in Kaduna. His body, he was killed. The war started on 6th of July, 1967. Nzogu was killed on the 29th of July, 1967. And there's a mystery as to the circumstance, precisely how he was killed. So this fellow who personally killed Sadana, yet his body was retrieved from Biafra and flown to Kaduna in the middle of the war and given an official state burial with full military honors. Now, this is one of the unanswered questions about this genocide. What really happened? How is that possible? And then when we look at Decree 34, you remember that one? That was the one that was supposed to have damned the Igbo peoples, that this was Ironsi pushing this decree, that the conventional explanation was that this was the decree that unified Nigeria and introduced a unitary system by dismantling the regions. But think about it. Military rule had kicked in on the 15th of January, 1966. Military rule, by definition, is unitary. You don't have regional governments under a military regime. It's a top-down, absolute command and control arrangement. It's a bit like colonial rule itself, that it is by command, and the scope for regional variations is non-existent. So what then did Decree 34, which was published by the Ironsi administration on the 24th of May, 1966, what was it doing? I'll tell you what I believe it was doing. It was simply the excuse for the pogroms that then followed, because the first round of pogroms now took place on the 29th of May, 1966, just 4 days afterwards. So the decree was 24th of May, and then 29th of May, sorry, 5 days afterwards, 29th of May, the first round of slaughter begins. Is it credible that the slaughter on that scale that took place on the 29th of May was planned just in the space of 5 days? Well, the evidence that it wasn't is this, that 29th of May date is a very significant date in the political affairs of the caliphates, which, if you recall what I said at the beginning, who were brought in to what became Nigeria, almost at the point of war with France. The 29th of May is Caliphate Day, if you like. It dates back to the fall of Constantinople to the forces of Islam, the Ottomans, on the 29th of May, 1453. That's when Constantinople, which was then the capital of the Christian Roman Empire, was conquered by the forces of Islam. And so when you now see that first round of pogroms happened on the 29th of May, you can begin to understand that that's Decree 34 that was promulgated on the 24th of May was simply a hanger on which to hook the first round of pogroms. And you then, it becomes clearer when you note that the second round was on the 29th of July, that was the counter coup, and the third round was the 29th of September. So carefully planned, carefully coordinated. As was the fact that a Christian northerner then becomes leader of the Supreme Military Council, despite not being the most senior ranking officer. That was Gowon. In my view, based on my research, that was simply to keep the international community off the scent, to prevent it appearing as a war against Christians. So you have a Christian northerner as head of the army. And once they've used him finished, as Professor Philip Effiong said, they discarded him. Then we go to the fighting itself and the actual war. And the central figure in this exercise is the British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson. This was one of the books that I read and I recommend that people read. Now, let's trace the process. The Northerners were shouting Araba to begin with. That was July 1966. They were saying Araba means that they were leaving. They were seceding. They were pulling out. Then the Aburi conference happens and the Aburi Accord, and an agreement is reached between the Nigerian parties to avoid the breakup and to keep Nigeria together. And then in 1967, the tune changes. It's now Operation Unicord. That was the actual operation name given to the war against the East and the Igbos in particular. Unicord, of course, is all to do with unity. To keep Nigeria one is a task that must be done. So the tune has changed completely from Araba in July 1966, and by July 1967, it is now to keep Nigeria one is a task that must be done. There's a publication that was sent to me by a mysterious figure, but I'm very grateful to him. It's a publication titled Biafra, the Nigerian Civil War, and is authored by a gentleman called Peter Baxter. And there were a number of interesting quotations in that book that I would like to share with you very quickly. The Nigerian armed forces were configured for peacekeeping and internal security, and a sense of invisibility that infused the rank and file had been honed on no greater challenge than the suppression of unarmed civilians and the killing of disarmed members of its own various battalions. This was not a professional army that was capable of carrying out that war even by itself. If there had been no external actors, that Nigerian army, so composed, so trained, could not have defeated the Igbos in the East. That is relevant in terms of understanding the role of Harold Wilson and the Labour government. And this is his book. It is his own memoirs. There's another quotation from the book that confirms what I've just said. 3rd Marine Commando Division was in fact a regular army formation with some amphibious capabilities as part of their operational remit, since most of their listed and recorded engagements were conventional combat operations. They were never formally designated as special forces. The amphibious capability of the force was provided mainly by outside advisors. And it goes on. By the summer of 1968, Adekunle's division had bloated to a strength of over 25,000 men, including the vital logistical capability to handle the many amphibious operations demanded by the terrain and the topographical circumstances of the South, which was provided by foreign, mainly British technical experts seconded to the Nigerian army in increasing numbers during this period. And finally, the final quotation from this book is this: the employment of white mercenaries on the federal side amounted to an admission that the Nigerian military establishment was incapable of policing its own borders, which for a military structure as august as that of Nigeria, bearing in mind its British origins, was an admission indeed. Now, on Harold Smith, it's interesting that when you contrast the role of the Harold Wilson government in this war, the Labour government, you contrast it with what they did elsewhere. So in the Spanish Civil War that occurred earlier in the 1940s, they adopted a position of strict neutrality. They wouldn't supply weapons, they wouldn't supply troops, and they wouldn't supply finance, strict neutrality. Whereas in the Biafra War, it was open partiality. Contrast also the attitude as far as Rhodesia is concerned, where the white minority regime there declared independence, unilateral declaration of independence in November 1965. There were no military forces deployed against them. The other interesting point that was touched on earlier, and it's always been a source of controversy between the Igbos and the Yoruba people, is the compensation, the £20 compensation policy. Now, I would like to recommend that my in-laws get hold of this book, which I only just came across very recently. There you will find that the origins, the real origins of the change of currency policy during the war, because it had been done against the Nazi Germany in 1948. 1948 was when the Reichsmark, that was the German currency at the time during the Nazi regime, was changed to the Dutch mark. And guess what? Regardless of how much the Germans had in their bank accounts at the date of that change of currency, they received 60 Dutch marks as in exchange. So this is the origin of this change of currency policy. And I was struck by the fact, and this is a particularly important detail, that once again, that change of currency, when you look for the date on which the change of currency during the Biafra War happened, when we changed from the pounds to Naira, guess what date it was? It's the signature date of the Caliphate, 29th of January, 1968. So Awolowo has been overcredited with genius. This is all came from the manual that was used in Germany by the Allied forces. And then finally, to underlining the central role of the Wilson government as far as this genocidal war was concerned, is the way the war actually ended. Because in that book that I referred you to earlier, Wilson had told Gowon expressly to allow Ojukwu to escape. Again, that was needed for the narrative to paint him as a coward who abandoned these people in order to destroy the spirit of the Igbo people. Here's the extract from the book. I wanted to be satisfied about the willingness of the federal government to negotiate on anything not involving dismemberment of Nigeria. In the event of a military victory, he should let the colonel slip through his hands to safety abroad. And as I said in my book, A Fatherless People, it should come as no surprise that the war ended precisely in accordance with Wilson's script, when at 2 a.m. on the 11th of January 1970, Colonel Ojukwu boarded the last flight from Biafra to safety. I shared this, again, I thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. My in-laws, this book that I've put up there is actually the book, the personal story of my mother-in-law, the story of the war experience, which I think will resonate with many in this audience. And I commend it to you, and I thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this very important discussion. Thank you.